and thank you for attending the Code Update Committee's third public meeting. And the topic tonight will be environment. The committee is comprised of Bonnie Carmesino, Karen Doyle, thank you, Nora Hart, yeah, right there, Paul Henderson, Anna Palaziri, and Michael Reisman. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Excuse me, sir, could you sign in? Thank you so much. As I just said, there's a sign-in sheet at the door. If you would please sign in. As it turns out, NYSERDA does require a list of the attendees. They require that we send them copies of the sign-in sheet, so it's most helpful to us. There are also hard copies on the table of both the slides that are being presented tonight, as well as the text documents that back up those slides. Again, a NYSERDA requirement is that we provide, as part of the meeting, the specific code updates that we're recommending and be enacted by the village board at some point in the future. So you will see in the text hard copy exactly what we're going to recommend. If you could go to the next slide, Paul. A little bit of history. In 2006 or 7, the village formed what was called the Special Board for a Comprehensive Plan, LWRP. That group worked on developing a comprehensive plan which, by law, was eventually adopted by the village in 2012. While that document was in the process of being adopted, the group, the Special Board for a Comprehensive Plan, LWRS, began working on the next phase of the comprehensive plan, which is known as the Local Waterfront Revitalization Strategy. That was completed in 2011. That group then continued to work on something called the Local Waterfront Revitalization Program. That document was completed in 2014. However, the New York State Department of State review, which is required by law, did not approve that document due to the lack of zoning items that the Department of State felt needed to be addressed. As a result of that action from the Department of State, the village obtained a grant from NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research Development Authority, and that grant is what's funding us, what's funding the Code Update Committee to address 29 code topics, which NYSERDA agreed were imperative to be added to the village code. And as a result of that, the Code Update Committee was formed to perform that work. So here we are tonight. The purpose of the meeting tonight, which is required by NYSERDA, is to review and recommend actions on a subset of the 29 topics which were defined, as I stated in the previous chart. There were 2 prior public meetings held. That those public meetings covered the topics of use and appearance. All the meeting materials are available on the village website, www.coldspringny.gov pages, coldspringny_code update, CUC public. So if you wish to look at the materials from the 2 previous public meetings, you can do so on that website. All of the materials from tonight's meeting are also on the village's website. They were placed out there on Monday. We are accepting comments tonight verbally, and we will accept written comments on the materials being presented tonight, both in the presentation and in the handouts, until September 22nd. Those comments can be sent by email to me, Trustee Early at coldspringny.gov, or to the Cold Spring Village Office, 85 Main Street, Cold Spring, New York. Attention, Code Update Committee. Those comments, both oral, both verbal and written, will be factored into what the Code Update Committee recommends to the village board. The previous topics, as I mentioned, which were covered in prior public meetings, were use, and those were the 10 topics in use, And the next category was appearances, and those were the topics in appearances. In the future, there are two more categories: procedures and consistency and clarity. And the required topics in each of those are 5 topics under procedures and 2 topics under consistency and clarity. So, tonight we're going to be presenting the 5 topics. And there they are: outdoor lighting, evaluate steep slope standards, evaluate flooding standards, evaluate adopting a ridgeline protection overlay district, and green building standards. Each one of the committee members will be presenting a set of slides on that topic, and the hard copy handout that you have provides the text that goes along with that. So with that, I will turn the meeting over to Paul Henderson, who will speak about outdoor lighting standards.
So first off, just to kind of give an overview of lighting and the lighting issues, this is the environment segment of this. So lighting, we're talking about natural lighting, in other words, the stars and the moon, and we're also talking about lighting the village, right? So, and they're at odds with each other a little bit, right? We want to be able to see the stars and the moon as much as possible, at the same time have safe and useful lighting within the village. So as far as the artificial, we have to be concerned about what are the sources of the power for that. We have nuclear power plants, we have coal fire, we have upstate, we have wind farm. We want to be reducing the amount of power that we consume as citizens, and also maintaining enough light that we can do what we need to do. So we're looking for efficiency, and these are the kinds of things that we also need to look at. The village of Cold Spring as an area, do you please sign in? Thanks. The Cold Spring as an area has a lot of diverse lighting needs at night, right? We have the riverfront, which has one kind of lighting atmosphere. We have Chestnut Street, where the food town is, and where the gas station is. That's a different kind. We have sports lights up at the school at night. And we also have just regular street lighting as well as residential lighting. And all of those things are things that we needed to look at. The kind of extreme contrast, although it's officially closed, I think at night, is Foundry Park, where there's really no lighting, right? And that's where one could presumably see stars if you wanted to, but then we have our wonderful guest across the river, West Point, that seems to have no limits on the amount of lighting that it uses. So what we looked at, if you can go to the next slide, we looked at the kind of predecessor texts, if you will, or Bible, kind of a comprehensive plan, waterfront revitalization strategy. We looked at Village of Cold Spring Code, and then we looked at other municipal codes, because the Village of Cold Spring Code doesn't currently have very much in it about lighting. You can have pool lighting if it's not high. And that's about it. There aren't a lot of comments on the lighting. Next slide. So within lighting, there are these different issues. One is that people talk about a lot is light trespass. That's when a light is either so high or so broad that it sheds light on every adjoining property and goes into windows and stuff. So that's one thing that we were wanting to look at. And then the other thing is just intensity of lighting. That was also something we looked at in terms of village lamping. In looking at, because there is very little in the code, and it's not really a zoning, part of the zoning code per se, we looked at adding a chapter to some other part of the code, maybe chapter 72. Because there are so many things that are relevant in terms of lighting and how we want to address it, and they do have this broad range in Cold Spring in particular, from, as I said, the riverfront and the boat club, which are kind of contrasting light levels, up to the kind of quietest, darkest area. The other thing I wanted to note is that, having now been walking around while it's summertime and people are away, I think that the village actually kind of relies on residential lighting to help light sidewalks. Like, for example, if you walk down Main Street on the south side of the street, if the house or those houses aren't inhabited, it's really dark. So it's something else that we need to kind of consider in there. Next. So as I was saying, the purposes and the intent is really to balance these goals of having efficient and practical lighting for everybody within the village, and maintaining the character, and at the same time just keeping the amount of light down. We've all learned, I think, that the amount of light we actually need to perform functions may be less than what we grew up with. When I was a kid, light seemed to be and energy seemed to be in overabundance, and why not have more light, right? We don't want that kind of a scenario anymore. So the sections of the code that, as it's written, and you can see it in the handout, it covers lots of different topics. There's of course the conformance, new lighting and existing lighting on public roadways. Frequently these codes don't address municipal lighting. In this one we actually do talk about street lighting and the light levels and the kind of lighting that is preferred. General outdoor lighting standards both for residences and for other uses. We talk about uplighting and when it's allowed. One of those instances is for a flag of a national entity. And then we talk about approvals. The last thing is the information sheet, which really means to say the illustrations. So if you go to the next. So these are some of the highlights. I skipped that one. So there was a fellow who, some many years ago, created a series of drawings that seem to be used in every single municipal code across the country. Bob Crayl and I exchanged emails with him. So he had this kind of unacceptable or discouraged category, which really meant that light was kind of bleeding all over the place. And then he had another segment, which was the acceptable, so next slide, which shows different kinds of fixtures or shielding or ways that the lighting can be performed. This was done back in 2005, and we all kind of readily acknowledge that lighting has changed considerably since 2005. So at some point, he says he's going to update this. But in any case, it's a kind of a useful tool to understand what lighting might be acceptable and what lighting not. So that's an overview of outdoor lighting. Any questions, or should we hold them to the end?
Should we hold questions to the end, or?
Anyone have questions now?
Whatever you want to do.
I have
Sure.
one question. I noticed in the definitions you have Kelvin, which generally would be the light temperature,
Mhm.
but I didn't see. Is there any indication of light temperature?
I believe that all of the definitions used are either in the text of the proposed code or they are part of the definition of one of the definitions in the code.
Okay.
So in order to understand some other element in here, you have to know about Kelvin.
I didn't see it. But I'll keep looking.
That's an easier thing than the search. Anything else? Okay. You can ask questions later too. Next. Bonnie.
Hello, everyone. Before I get started here, I just want to make a comment on the handout here. In the definitions, there's a little confusion. It is a 15% that triggers the provision, so in the slope definition needs to be updated there, just so it's the 15% we're talking about. Steep slope standards, that's next. Okay, as we know, we have steep slopes in this village, and we have retaining walls. Just a few examples, but they're all over the place. There are currently no local regulations governing disturbance of steep slopes or construction of retaining walls. Next slide, please. And Disturbance of steep slopes can cause erosion, slope failure, and destruction of property. The construction of retaining walls can impact the visual character of the village in both positive and negative ways. So that was the reason that we were asked to consider this issue. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this all is to protect the environment and avoid erosion, slope failure, destruction of property, and detrimental impact on village character. Next slide, please. The methodology that we've been working on is to provide guidelines for when oversight is needed relating to steep slopes and retaining walls, to provide a procedure for oversight when appropriate with standards for review, and have the approval authority, either the code enforcement officer or the planning board for projects requiring planning board approval. Provide a procedure for variances if appropriate in specific situations, and allow customary landscaping without a permit. So another piece of this all is that there is a procedure in place if there's going to be a project involving building permits to make sure the steep slope situations are considered, taken into account, and properly dealt with. But there's also a procedure in the new code so that if it's a small little project that it doesn't really it doesn't make sense to be requiring all this information, you can apply for a waiver or saying this really doesn't apply in this case. And in that case, they can say either, hey, you're right, you can go ahead and do that, or no, that really does require this. Because I mean, there have been situations in the village where people have disturbed slopes and there's a possibility of buildings collapsing. So that's the reason that this is all being done. So that is all. Are there any questions? Yes, Bill.
What is customary landscape?
Customary landscaping, that is, you plant some things, you prune your trees, you have it right. Customary landscaping involves minor grading or filling in connection thereto, provided that such activities conform. It shall mean land maintenance involving tree trimming, pruning, removal of dead or diseased vegetation, lawn and garden care, planting of decorative trees, shrubs, and plants.
Oh, so, I'm sorry, so the concern is I want to prune my tree, but the tree is on a steep slope, do I need a permit or something?
To prune the tree now.
Yeah, just asking.
Yeah.
Fine.
Okay. Yeah, yes.
I was wondering about the height of a steep, what if there's like a 4-foot drop off at the edge of a property or a 3-foot drop? Is that a steep slope? It could be in, like a 90-degree angle.
Another requirement is it has to occur over, I believe it's over at least 100 square feet. So it's kind of like if you have this one giant little mound, that's not going to trigger the provisions of it. It has to be something that, basically 10 foot by 10 foot that has the continued steep slope. But you are correct. Like in the village where we've got our retaining walls, that is a steep slope.
Okay.
And so, of course, repairing retaining walls, it doesn't require a steep slope permit. But if you had a steep slope and you put in a retaining wall, then that would. But I mean, that's because there are currently the state rules about making, secure retaining walls. But also things that you don't, we have limits on the heights of fences, but theoretically you could just put up a retaining wall without being in the appropriate size for the village. So like when so part of the regulations here prohibit somebody from just coming and putting up a 10-foot retaining wall right next to your house or something. That makes sense?
Yeah, I was just thinking about like the edge of a property, there's often just like a 3-foot drop off.
Right.
And it may or may not have a wall now. Is that a steep slope? Like it might be 3 feet, but 100 feet long or 50 feet long.
Yeah.
That's a steep slope.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, if you go back a couple of slides, the pictures. Like right up here, we have, got it's not exactly a retaining wall, but that's the type of retaining wall.
Is that Wall Street?
That is just north of the top lot,
Oh,
okay?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so for example, here, this is very obviously a steep slope, you know, because there we have the retaining wall and it's holding back the sliding wedge going all the way up there, so. And then, I mean, this is the kind of thing that, you know, if this was not secure, that would be collapsing the sidewalk, and we don't want that to happen.
Oh, the Green Street where the stones have fallen.
Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
I tried to read really quickly, but does anywhere in this write-up specifically prohibit clearings, vegetated steep slopes, or would that fall within routine maintenance?
We actually discussed that quite a lot in the committee, and what we came down to was that general maintenance would not be included. But it's a real question, like how much are you disturbing this slope? I mean, if you're just going out and clearing the weeds, clearing preparing for landscaping, but if you start regrading things, then that's not included. Any other questions? Very good. So, Nora.
So, the committee took on the issue of floodplain protections because the comprehensive plan that Marie mentioned earlier made a very specific recommendation to, quote, consider floodplain protection measures and ensure that residents are informed of any changes in the FEMA insurance floodplain map that may affect their properties. So, next slide. So the issues we looked at were the methods to secure fuel tanks, above ground and below ground fuel tanks, and the possibility of allowing 3 stories in flood zones, and deleting references to mobile homes and manufactured homes, because they're not allowed in the village, so we don't need. Next slide, please. On the issue of anchoring fuel tanks, we decided that we should just refer, in the code, it should just refer to the FEMA website, and in particular, FEMA has it's like a booklet or whatever online, and it's very helpful, and there's a whole lot of concerns really depending on how big the fuel tank is, whether it's above ground, below ground, so we wouldn't seek to reiterate all that information, but we refer the reader, as you can see. But we are requiring people to anchor fuel tanks, and next slide. There'll be pictures. I'll show you how much damage can be done from unanchored fuels. Next slide. The issue of 3 stories in flood zones, we were considering, for instance, down by the waterfront where there was damage to properties, and people have, in some communities, have allowed homes or buildings to go to a 3rd story in order to allow for a sacrificial first floor that would for repeated or frequent flooding, and we determined that was not a good idea, just because of the views are so phenomenal, and that would allow another 15 feet or another story to impede the views. So we're not doing that. We're not allowing it. Next slide. And this is pretty self-explanatory. The code will, mobile homes and manufactured homes, the terms are deleted. Next slide. So, this picture's not so great, you can't really see it, but this is an example of it, and the FEMA website they show you, this is a fuel tank carried off by floodwater. And because these tanks sometimes are full of air, this is, there's something called the buoyancy effect. They are very, very, buoyancy effect, there you go, it's powerful, a very powerful effect. This came crashing through a parking lot, the asphalt. Next slide.
That's not Cold Spring, is it?
No, it isn't. No. This is from the FEMA guide, but I mean, I couldn't even conceive of this kind of damage, but there it is. Okay, next slide. So these are the kinds of guidelines that are given, and it shows you straps, different kinds of concrete pads, and these different kinds of anchors that are to be used, and there's a lot of information there. And here's an example, a below ground tank has to be not only strapped to the ground, but there has to be anchors, and the pad that the anchors go into also have to be gauged appropriately for the size of the tank. I think that's the last slide. Any questions?
Don't we already have 3-story buildings on the waterfront? It doesn't look to me to be a problem to add more. And that sacrificial floor sounds like a great idea.
Well, currently the height restriction is 2.5 stories.
2.5.
2.5.
What's the hotel?
The hotel is 3, and there are some other 3-story buildings below the railroad tracks. What this is saying is that the recommendation is not to allow additional construction of 3-story buildings. The construction that went on Main Street and West Street and New Street, the condos, those are 2.5.
But there are some 3 stories there.
The hotel and the 2-story, the 2 buildings on West Street on the north end are both 3-story buildings. There's also a 3-story building on the corner of Main Street and Fish Street. Sorry, there are 2 3-story buildings. One is on the corner of Main and Fish, and the other is on the corner of Main and Market.
There are a lot of pre-existing
Yeah.
non-conforming structures, and I guess.
I'm just saying, are they really blocking the village's view? If they're already there, are we distressed by how high those 3-story buildings now? What would more 3-story buildings?
Well, it's a great comment, thank you. We will make note of it, and maybe people will tend to agree with you. Anyone else agree with that? Just you.
Ask one quick question.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Well, I was wondering, now, I feel like I should know this, but I'm assuming you're not I guess what I'm wondering is it a good idea to have buried tanks anyway in a floodplain?
That's a good point, right. No, they are discouraged, but we didn't say they're not allowed, but they are discouraged. And, there's cases where people wouldn't have anywhere else to put it, and some people have them now, and the code would require them, if they replace the tank that's already, that's located below ground, we will require them to anchor it, so that's what that is intended for.
Don't the anchors apply to above ground tanks also?
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yep, so they don't float away.
Sorry, one more.
Sure.
What exactly is a half a story?
What's a half a story? Well, it's with a pitched roof.
Half a story is
Floor
defined,
area,
the
box
for
for-
half a story is defined in the code bill. It is a story where the square footage
Yes.
of the 3rd floor is less than 50% of the square footage of the 2nd floor.
Okay.
As measured from the floor of the 3rd floor to the ceiling of the 3rd floor, in the areas where, Aaron, correct me, is it 6 foot? 5 foot? So where the ceiling is 5 foot or more, any area below that.
Oh, it
That
must be
area
no
is-
more than 50%.
Yes.
So you could in fact have 50% and have some dormers or something under 5 feet, and that would conform,
If you
very
have-
short people.
If you have dormers that are
Under 5 feet,
that is
that would conform to
acceptable.
that. Okay,
Correct.
just Now I know.
But it's a good point, I think the building height would still be 35 feet, so I don't know, maybe you raise a good point. I'm on your side. Any other questions? Thanks. Who's next?
Me. Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. So this topic, it turned out we didn't have any code amendments or changes. But we were required under the NYSERDA. As Mary explained at the beginning, with the topics, and this was one of the things that we needed to look into. So we did. And I almost feel like mine is going to be longer than everyone else's because we really put a lot of thought into it. And to come up to the decision of to not do something, sometimes it needs a little more explained. So we just want to make sure we can let you guys know what we went through. So first of all, we really had a big long discussion about what even is a ridgeline, what's a ridgeline overlay protection district. So this is just a list of what we consider as a group, as a committee. Through each slide, you go to the next slide. So we started off with, we had a long discussion. What is the definition of ridgeline? And before we looked in the dictionary, we had all kinds of ideas. Are we talking about looking at is it the view shed? Are we standing up on a ridgeline? And does it depend how far can you see? Does it depend what it looks like from somewhere else? So we decided to do two things. One was look it up in the dictionary, and the second one was to start looking at other codes that had this protection overlay district in it, including Phillipstown has one, which we'll get to at the end, and just see if we have this in Cold Spring. Is this something that we want to protect in that way? So basically, the definition was a line formed along the highest points of a mountain ridge. And an area of higher ground separating two adjacent streams or watersheds. So we together said, well, maybe let's think about our village, and again, I don't know how many people are familiar with the boundaries of the village. Sometimes people don't realize how far out we go, but really our highest point, and this is thanks to Paul Henderson, found a nice topo map, our highest point in the village is 280 feet. Just behind Haldane High School. If you were to go up to the high school and look towards Bull Hill, I don't even know if anyone even gets back there. It's back in the woods somewhere, but that's the highest point. If you're kind of walking around the village, you get to like Town Hall area. Maple Terrace across the street from Town Hall is very high, but is it really one of these definitions? We're not so sure. So you can go to the next slide. And then we just talked about what is the overlay district in general. And the purpose of a ridgeline overlay protection overlay district is to protect ridgelines from potentially hazardous development, for example, resulting in landslides, excessive erosion, flooding. Now you can imagine, we did talk about steep slopes in this conversation too. It was like, is there maybe steep slopes covers these issues for us? We had to really think about that too. Or land uses that would negatively impact views of the ridgelines from off-site vantage points, which that's obviously something that came up in our local waterfront revitalization plan work about people walking in Foundry Cove, and when they're looking from the Foundry, what does the village look like, and is that something that we want to protect? Okay, next slide. And then I just mentioned, in the local waterfront revitalization strategy, because part of our work in this committee was to go back, and this all stems from our comprehensive planning process and our local waterfront revitalization work. And this recommendation is in our LWRS, and it is to protect views of the ridge. So this was a specific ridge viewed from Foundry Trail and Foundry Cove, and we protect that. Is the idea we use conservation easements, local enforcement of we call it the SAS, but it stands for Scenic Areas of Statewide Significance Guidelines, and or creation of a ridgeline protection overlay district, which I think that's where NYSERDA got this task from, is right there. So we found it in the LWRS. Okay, next slide. So after we came up with, okay, what's the district, what does it do we have any in the village, we all brainstormed for a while. We were texting each other and going around the village and just trying to see and you can't really see this, I think they're listed in the handout, with the bullet points if you, it's hard to see up on the slide, but I mean, we had everything, and you might even come up with others, but we tried to think of them all. The Northern Gate properties on the east side of the railroad tracks, Highway Garage property. Someone said, oh, what about the Haldane softball field? You know, if you think about the village, and Bonnie showed in her slides, you know, we do have a lot of what you might think might be a ridge line, but we had to kind of go back and forth based on the definition, based on other codes, which I'll get to that next. Anyway, so that's the list if it's on this next slide. So we looked at the other codes that we could find. NYSERDA had recommended this Williston, Vermont. As you can imagine, I've never been to Williston, but it sounds like they have very large ridges, and it's not Cold Spring. I mean, it was, and I can't remember the exact heights, and that's how we went back and looked at, well, how high are our highest points? I think, if anyone here remembers, was it 500 feet was the ridge line? Does anyone remember? Maybe it was higher than that in some of these codes, but it was definitely higher than we've got here. Village of Sloatsburg was interesting because it's a village. I've never been there, but what was it, Paul? You've been there? And the topography is just, they've got undeveloped ridges that are very visible on the outskirts of their village, right? Is that? So that didn't really fit what we have here either, and this was another example that we looked into. Okay, next slide. So to speed us along to the end of our process, based on the definitions, based on what's, and I think these codes might be available online, or I certainly am able to share them with anybody that might want to look at those codes that we looked at. Our findings at the highest point in the village is about 280, I think is the high point. That was, I can't remember now. 280, I think, is the highest above the Haldane High School. The Campbell Ridge elevation, which is the one that was referred to in the LWRS as we were walking along the Foundry Trail, is about 40 to 70 feet over sea level. So it's not, it doesn't fit the definition of a ridge. That ridge, if you're walking along the Foundry Trail back towards into Foundry Creek, it does rise up, and up at Chestnut Street, as high as it gets is 140 feet. Okay, next slide. Oh, and here's a picture, but you can't see that great. So this is like when you're coming down the Foundry Trail, that's the Campbell House in the back. That's the ridge that's about 40 to 70 feet. This is the one that when you're coming down Kemmel Avenue into Foundry, the West Point Foundry Preserve, and the parking areas on your left if you're coming in, on the right. This is the end of the Marathon property. And again, I think that's about 40 to 70 feet max. Okay, next slide. So after all the evaluating and doing all those things that I just described to you, the Code Update Committee concluded that regulations similar to those that we've discovered in other villages are not appropriate for our village, based on the size of our village, the highest elevations, the fact the village is primarily built out at this point, and the major ridge lines requiring protection are outside of our village, and as I mentioned earlier, are subject to Phillipstown's scenic ridgeline protection regulations, and that's the citation for where those are located in the town code. And so our conclusion is we identified areas to consider, which is that list I just showed you. We reviewed the LWRS recommendations and the code examples from other communities. Next slide. And in the end, since we just determined not to create a ridgeline overlay protection district, we do want to make a point to recommend to the village board that there were two other recommendations to consider in protecting this list of areas that we don't want to just ignore them, because we do have a lot of scenic areas and scenic viewpoints, and maybe they're built out, but there might be other ways to protect those, and look into conservation easements and or local enforcement of the statewide areas of scenic significance guidelines as per the recommendation of the local waterfront revitalization strategy. Thank you. Any questions? Yes?
Why is NYSERDA concerned about ridge lines?
I don't, Marie can chime in, but I believe that NYSERDA pulled that task out from that language in the local water, we mentioned it in our local waterfront revitalization strategy. And I believe NYSERDA, because I think we want to turn this into an LWRP program. Is that what, Marie, is that? So they went through our comprehensive plan and LWRS and pulled out topics for us to address with this process, with the code update committee. And I think they saw this as something that we should look into and said, why don't you do that before your LWRS becomes an LWRP? Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they're concerned about it, but I believe it came from our own LWRS. Any other questions? Yes.
So the Kemble Ridge, if you follow it east, all the way up to 9
Right.
to 9D
Right.
and then beyond,
Right,
it's actually a ridge between two streams, which is one of
Correct.
the first definitions.
correct.
But that wasn't enough to qualify it.
Well, you know, it's interesting to say that. The village boundary does go beyond that bridge. And whether it's because there are houses there, I mean, we considered everything, including the height. And what's built out there and what, you know, so,
Mhm.
I mean,
Well,
it is.
The stream goes further west. So it goes underground, but there is a stream
Yeah.
there
Yeah,
separating the bridge.
that go,
The back brook, which goes under the church.
yes, yes, the church, you mean St. Mary's, or?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Oh, it's split, right, Margaret's Brook turns back, you're right. Well, it does, you're right, it goes both direct, and then the Foundry Brook comes and goes under the bridge there. Are we talking about two different bridges? I'm talking about where, by Downey Oil, where you cross over right there. Is that-
Right, so that's
Yeah.
one stream, and then the other one is right behind the first row houses on Main.
Mhm.
I think one of the issues is, when you're talking about ridgeline protection, you're looking at something that you're looking up to, whereas like the stream by Downey Oil, that's something, yes, it's natural land, but it's like dams, so people aren't, it's not, if something was done to that, it wouldn't be changing what you can see when you're like looking out.
Right,
Yeah.
but the other purpose for ridgeline protection is similar to the steep slopes, is to protect from erosion and other destruction of that ridgeline. So it's really both, it's the view of it and it's protecting it from,
Right, and
you know.
to the point of the question, the Foundry Trail, that goes past the ruins, I mean, it does look up at ridges on both sides, in particular on the south side of Foundry Brook.
Mhm.
Now,
Mhm.
also to your point that, a concern or the concern about, I mean, it's all owned by Scenic Hudson at this
Right.
juncture.
Right.
But, things can change in the future, of course, but the concern about development that is a very, very, very steep slope. And so the
Mhm.
concern about development would potentially be addressed by the steep slopes law.
Right, for that, for that slope, for that, it is a slope. I mean, the top is the ridge, but the slope is what comes down from it, right? And we have that. So there you go. So is there another slide? That's it, right? Okay. Oh, another question? Yeah.
I don't know if this is the proper place to mention my worry, but I like to walk on Lund Terrace. I think it's one of the nicest walks of all. And then I walk to the train, of course, on the other side. There's one of Lund Terrace on either side of the road. And what I worry about is all the stuff growing out of the rocks. And will it make these stones crumble? Well, they just crumble.
You have the
Because
rocks.
there's so much rock.
You have the rocks protected, on Terrace.
Lund Terrace, you know, when you walk to the train.
Yeah, no, I think that was one of our,
They're
we
big.
talked about that one. Lund Terrace, as it rises on either side of the railroad tracks, but you're right, even as you're walking on that.
Even as you're
Road.
going, on the road, there's a lot of stuff growing, but then there are real trees growing when you walk to the train, which you almost can't see because there's so many weeds now, because there's so much rain. But it seems to me it could crumble if the roots of the trees really get, I mean, that's what nature does.
Right.
Trees really make rocks and
Right.
stones crumble.
I guess the first thing to figure out is who owns that property. I don't know if it's village property or if it's owned by the homeowner who lives up there. And then kind of reach out to them about,
I don't think it's stones though.
I don't know who owns it. I'm sorry, yes.
Did you consider view shed at all, the concept of view shed when you were looking at ridge lines? So
We
the-
did.
the
I
idea
think
that-
so, yeah.
That you could block somebody's view of the hills across the river or something like
Somebody else's view. Oh, well, the view, when you're looking at ridge lines to regulate within your own jurisdiction, it's hard to, we had
Right,
a
I
lot of
know-
discussion about this, like, is it about protecting the view from the ridge line? And we determined that that was not the purpose of the ridge line protection overlay district, was to protect the views that you would see, for example, across the river.
that. Right.
It's the, I think the SAS covers, people look, like if you're on the river in a boat and you're looking at Cold Spring. And the SAS came up a lot with the Nelsonville cell tower, you know, that, you don't hear much about it, and then it came up with, hey, there's a guidelines about what you can put up that people are gonna see when they're looking at your,
So it's not, I understand it's not part of the overlay, requirement that you
Mhm.
consider the overlay
Mhm.
district. It's come up on the zoning board where
Mhm.
people have had a view and
Mhm.
then somebody builds and now the view is diminished. And
How
the
would you protect
question,
that?
the question was, there's nothing in the code now, but this might be the place where you would have considered adding that to the code. So I'm curious if that came up at all.
We talked a lot about that kind of a thing, and then we looked at a view line protection overlay as a tool, or how it's really what its purpose is and how it's used. That was not something that's covered by, it's covered by other things. You know, there are scenic overlays, there are obviously there's zoning considerations. If there, you know, there are lots of other ways to address that issue. The creation of a ridgeline overlay district, and based on all of those elements that we went through, is not, I don't think was, you know, we did talk about that kind of an idea. Like, are we talking about people looking in? Are we looking out? I think it's a little bit of a different issue. We did talk about that. It was part of our consideration. But again, all comments that are made tonight are noted, right? So thank you for that.
Sure.
That's
So
interesting. And that's come up at the zoning board
It sounds
is
like,
interesting.
it sounds like then that the village is gonna continue to have no view shed regulations, so.
I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that we evaluated adopting a ridgeline overlay district, and we came out with that we would not recommend that. Yes.
I would just make one point that the height restriction that was discussed earlier is a form. I mean, it's not maybe precisely what you're asking about, but it is a form of view shed protection, 35 feet, 2.5 stories, and, you know, and all the dimensions that Marie very astutely went over. And so the idea that, you know, you can't have a 3-story block size, you know, block shaped building. It's got to have, you know, angles and dormers, maybe if it's going to be that high, whatever, but it's a version of that.
It is, and I think, based on all the research that we did in the reading of other codes, I think a scenic protection is which is different than a ridgeline protection. If you look at the Phillipstown code, and I don't know if we have it cited in here, it gives a great definition of the different types of protections. And right, I think protecting someone's view is different than a ridgeline protection, but there are other tools for that. And I wouldn't say that the village has decided not to protect views.
Well, the village doesn't
think that.
have any protection for it. No.
So then
just
it's
not-
something
not
that
part of
can be
the
raised with the
research.
village. But
It's just not part of it.
Right, it wasn't part of our
Research.
exercise.
That,
It
I
sounds
mean, it
like
is a
there's
good
an-
point. I think it does need to be considered by the village. It's just not part of this.
this
Kind of
particular
assignment, yeah.
exercise,
Right.
correct? But your comment is noted. Any other comments? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. We come to a very exciting topic, but with very little specificity because it's rapidly evolving as a field. Next. So, what we're really talking about is standards for design and construction that reduce the use of energy and other resources such as water. and it's undergoing much discussion, change, and activity. The comprehensive plan in 2012 recommended that we have more stringent standards than the New York State Energy Code, that we encourage green building, and that we require meeting Energy Star, and that we encourage LEED, which is Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. Building on that, our consultant Green Plan had a number of recommendations this year. First of which was to expand the purposes of the zoning law to include indeed two conservation issues, basically, energy and water. Then they also recommended, and this is not a code issue, that we become a climate smart community. Additionally, that incentives be provided, such as fee waivers for solar and other desirable provisions, including, for example, expedited approvals. And then that the comprehensive green building code would not be appropriate for Cold Spring. There were no similar examples of green building codes, so we decided that it would be inappropriate for Cold Spring to pursue that kind of specificity. But our recommendations, and I will repeat myself here, but illustrations here, one very prime example of energy are the solar panels shown in this illustration on a house that may be familiar to many of you. It's on High Street. And then this one is harder to see what it is, but it's very thick walls with a great deal of insulation. So increasing your insulation is one of the things that you could do. But the recommendations that we are making, one, Cold Spring had at one point considered becoming a climate smart community and decided not to do so. And there are something like 10 elements of becoming a climate smart community. But we believe that in view of the increased interest in climate energy conservation, that we should reconsider becoming a climate smart community, that the purposes of the code should be expanded, and the existing code purposes are in your handout, and they're good, solid, standard recognitions for purposes, but that we should expand the purposes of our code to be updated to include the conservation of energy and water. And further, that we encourage the adoption of incentives for voluntary use, and this is important, that many things can be voluntary, but we did not want to require any such measures. So voluntary incentives for voluntary use of LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. Incentives similarly, Passive House and other standards, and also for the use of solar and other energy and conservation techniques. So that is what we have recommended. And welcome any questions or comments, what you would like to see the village do. Yes.
Thanks a lot. I have a few things. I can submit some in writing, but one topic that seems particularly relevant, talking about the thick walls and a lot of the zero lot line buildings, would be, I was curious if you thought about setback considerations for thick insulation.
Setback for insulation? I'm
Well,
sorry, I'm not,
Variance
I'm sorry, variance.
to improve insulation.
Right, that's, I didn't express it well.
Yeah.
Either a variance or also, if someone can only build a certain size, they may not
then
want
you
a
could
thick wall.
extend it out.
Correct.
That is a
Yeah.
great
That's a great idea.
Yeah, it is.
To incentivize it, because we couldn't think of, we can't offer tax incentives or anything, but that's a really good thought.
Any other comments, observations,
Sorry,
questions?
what did you have in mind in terms of variance even?
Well, one, I mean, the most simple would be that if a structure was already built to all of its setback limitations, but wanted to insulate outside of that, that could be allowed by right. It's a little more complicated on Main Street if you wanted to be building out into the right of way.
So what are you suggesting, 1 foot variance?
Yeah, I don't know, I guess I'd have to think of the,
You
I guess it would
said you
be-
would give further thought and
Sure.
put some in writing,
Okay, I'll
which
do
would
that.
be very
Yeah, please
valuable.
do.
It's a very good idea.
Yeah. Great idea.
Yes, Fran.
And did the committee come up with any thoughts on incentives? What kind of incentives you wanted to offer?
The question is often fee waivers, or fee reductions. Those are the main ones. Let's see, expedited processing. Now, we have the good fortune here that we haven't had any difficulties with expedited, processing delays, approval delays. On the other hand, I suppose we might run into a problem in the future, and it might be worth codifying expedited processing.
What about somehow making lower building loan rates available if the village were to somehow back?
Rates by banks?
Yeah, the village were to somehow back
Oh,
the
underwriting?
loans, help underwrite the
Loan
loans.
underwriting?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, Ann? I didn't hear Aaron's.
If maybe the village could help underwrite the loans for improvements that followed the recommendations.
Do you have any idea what that might mean financially? It sounds conceivably substantial.
It sounds difficult for the village, but
I'm not sure.
$75 off your zoning application isn't really gonna encourage anybody either.
I'm not sure legally we can back anybody's loans. I don't think legally we could do that.
Should we take that under advisement and check it out?
well, there's PACE financing, which is being considered by Putnam County, but I think that's through. If you look at a map of which counties have adopted PACE financing, you'll see Putnam County is like a little
What exactly is that?
property assessed. I get lost to what the C and E
And
is. but
substantively,
It's basically you get, it's essentially that, it's financing through your you essentially pay the financing of energy improvements through your property tax bill. It's controversial, but they've done it in Dutchess and Ulster and,
Is this like a
Orange.
pilot?
what's that?
Is that like a pilot?
Well, they've done it in Dutchess.
Payment in lieu of taxes, pilots.
Oh, I just know it's called PACE. And, they've done it in Dutchess and Orange and Ulster and Westchester, but for some reason Putnam County can't do it.
Yeah, I have two quick thoughts on that. I mean, number one, I think, as you can tell from the presentations, we're always looking to other examples, right, of communities, not just like Cold Spring, but in this region for ideas. So certainly that's something to consider. Number two, just on the issue of incentives, and I think you mentioned, I thought I heard you say building permit fee reductions and those sorts of things that we did discuss to a certain extent, things that would perhaps, looking at it from a certain perspective, would negatively impact the village's finances in terms of lower building permit fees, or I don't know the details about PACE, but it sounds like from what you're saying, it could perhaps result in a lower assessment of property or lower taxes, property taxes paid by qualifying homeowners. And you know, those things could be problematic for other reasons, and, you know, it's something to think about, and obviously we've discussed it a bit.
We
and
were
I think there's
very
more.
reluctant to
Yeah.
anything that would reduce or cause challenges economically for the village.
But I think what Ethan's talking about, it's not a payment in lieu of taxes, it's some sort of enforcement mechanism, like it makes the debt you owe to whoever's financing the solar panels, for example, becomes a lien, just like your taxes are. And I don't think, and also I think underwriting, what this gentleman mentioned, I think that a village could become a guarantor, and I don't think it means there's some exposure, I guess, but you could be a guarantor on, these are small loans, right? Loans for energy efficiency improvements, we're not talking about $1 million mortgage, but
No, but 20 significant funds.
So maybe Village of Cold Spring can maybe talk to banks that are operating locally and see if they can come up with some solutions that they can offer to the local, they want local business, and, you know, if there's some sort of, incentives that they can provide, maybe that's one way.
Favorable consideration.
Right, because they want more business from local residents. Maybe that's something that they can look into. And then I missed the fine points of why we decided not to do the climate smart community. Is it too many hurdles? Was that?
I wasn't involved in and don't have extensive information about what happened when they decided not before, but today we are encouraging that we go ahead and give it serious consideration, reconsider again.
And then one other comment, the Energy Star program, what I was told by our Energy Star Rater consultant was that it's so hard for the existing houses to meet that criteria. And so I think you have to find some sort of workaround on that, but that's what I heard.
That's one of the things that we did discuss is the hardship to people to require, meeting standards that are very expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, LEED is a very complex process for the homeowner to pursue. As an example. Any other comments, questions? Marie, are you up for? Yes?
I have a question, it's like a different angle, because I don't know if it is the top, I wouldn't want to comment if it's not part of this whole topic. It seems like something that the Village of Cold Spring really has going for it is it's a walkable community. And I don't know but there are gaps. There's gaps in the sidewalks and gaps. And I don't know, would it be part of this to require filling in those gaps when there's redevelopment, or is that a separate?
That's an interesting topic. I'm not sure it's specifically green building.
But, yeah, I would argue it is. But that's
Safety issues.
Yeah.
Anybody
I think
else?
it is though, actually, just
You
from,
think it's a green,
I do believe
because it would
is.
encourage walking?
I think
or-
walkable community, because I'm actually on the Climate Smart Community Phillipstown, so I've been reading Drawdown, and it's a really fascinating book, and it talks, there's a lot of talk about building retrofit, but there's all sorts of other things that are important, but walkable communities is a big part of climate action. So I do
Yeah.
actually think it's part of it, but I don't know if it's part of the code, I guess, is my
Well,
question.
it's definitely part of either the comp plan or the LWRS in terms of recommendations, and I'm vaguely recalling a map of missing sidewalks that Mike Armstrong may have put together or commissioned, and, it's certainly an important topic. Apparently
It's not a green building issue necessarily, but it's one for us to
It's not
consider.
one of the topics that
Yeah.
NYSERDA pointed to and said,
Yeah.
include this in the 29 topics that you're addressing with this grant money that we're providing, but it's
Sure.
definitely an issue.
Oh, yes, and I heard that, in New Paltz, there are 3 village, stations for, charging your car, electric cars.
Yeah,
And they're free to use in New Paltz.
free to use?
Free.
For like an
Three-
hour or something.
3 charging stations for electric cars
Yeah.
provided by the
Charging
village.
Can someone repeat what Jen was Sorry, Jen.
Somebody told me who lives in New Paltz, he just got a Prius, it's electric. And in the village of New Paltz, there are 3 electric charging,
Yes,
whatever they're called,
yes,
stations,
yes,
free for the user.
yes.
In other words, he can charge his car for free.
Yes, and the village of Cold Spring looked at that, and the problem is to have a charging station, it's most economical to have 2 charging for 2 cars at once for 1 charging station, and you have to set aside 2 parking spaces for 2 cars to be charged.
Yeah.
And we have a problem. We don't have 2 parking spaces, there's no electricity at the municipal parking lot, so that's not a viable option.
In
So-
10 years though, it's gonna be mandatory.
Excuse me, I wasn't finished.
I'm
So
sorry.
what we're looking at is working with the village, with the town of Phillipstown to create an electric parking station on Cedar Street. The town of Phillipstown is considering that and we're gonna go with that.
Oh, good, I'm gonna tell my,
So go buy
You do
your
that,
electric
Jane.
car.
I'll tell them we're gonna have it fixed.
On the topic of walkable community, for me, it would be great if I don't have to get in the car to go to a gym, or to go to BJ's. That would be my idea of walkable community. Which
So what would you like us to do about that?
We want a BJ's.
Bring a BJ's. No, because that would change the character of the
Yeah.
village. But what I'm saying is maybe encouraging business, economic, small businesses to thrive that caters to, so I don't want to have to get in the car to go get my shoe repaired or, so if there's an economic, incentives for local businesses
It's a
to,
question of whether there's a market,
yeah.
significantly, I think. Any other comments, questions on any of this? I'm sure Marie would welcome them, all of us would welcome any aspect of it, Steve.
I'm really concerned about the floodplain. We all know what's gonna happen. It's gonna become increasingly difficult to live below the tracks. And at some point, there may not be a below the tracks. I just think anything that will make it safer to build and live down there, I think it's just imperative that we do it, or we're not being responsible to our citizens. One other thing, I don't think we should rely on the real estate industry to let people know what they're getting into down there. I saw, updating residents on floodplain changes, floodplain map, that's great. I also think we should be informing anyone who wants to purchase down there what they're getting into. That, it may not be there for their children and grandchildren.
Is that our responsibility? Is an interesting question.
Well, as, we take care of our citizenry.
You're not taking care of the citizens who currently own the buildings.
Excuse me?
If someone lives down there and currently owns a building and someone wants to buy it and you're telling them don't buy it because it's gonna flood, is that our responsibility?
I think so. I think so. I think so. We probably should be saying more about that. We have a former Superfund site in the village too. I think it is the response. To take care of the safety of people and their property.
Point well taken.
But the sacrificial first floor, I think it's a great idea, and it's what's happening you know, like Lower Manhattan, it's happening in Florida, is you know, in Miami, it's already, you've got to build the streets up now. But it's just a matter of time before we're in that same situation here, where we either build up or don't build at all on the floodplain.
Well, they're required to carry insurance and they're a designated flood hazard area, so, I mean, it's not like they need us to tell them, you know, that those properties are threatened.
Anyway, Marie may want to, yes.
Oh. I didn't mean to cut anyone off.
No,
On a real maybe simpler note, on the general outdoor lighting standards, I thought it could read, particular care to be taken to assure that direct illumination does not fall onto or across any public or private street or road or body of water. Just a thought.
Do you want to?
You're asking to add something?
Oh, add or body of water.
So you don't eliminate the river, for example?
Yeah.
Ethan, I didn't hear, what was it that you're saying?
Oh, I was just recommending adding on general outdoor lighting standards 3, after any public or private street or road, to add or body of water.
Have you got that, Paul? Okay, got it, thank you.
Marie, do you want to close? I know we are grateful for your comments,
Thank
questions.
you.
Very helpful to know that they're interesting.
Just,
Such good ideas.
to reiterate, any additional any additional comments that you may have, please send them to the village office, 85 Main Street, Cold Spring, New York. We will be accepting written comments through September 22nd. You can also email me, trustee.early@coldspringny.gov. So, thank you very much for taking your time in the middle of the week to come out on a hot and humid night to sit with us in the air conditioning while a new roof is being put on the firehouse, for which we're all very grateful. So thank you again. Anything you've forgotten, come to us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.